Story 1. The Bog's Secret. Last August, I sought refuge at my uncle's isolated fishing lodge, a solitary haven approximately 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks, Alaska. He had owned the place since the early 70s, a run-down, forgotten cabin nestled perhaps half a mile from where a pristine tributary fed into the mighty Tanana River. I had frequented this sanctuary since childhood, but that particular summer I came alone, the ink barely dry on my divorce papers, desperately needing a quiet place for my shattered thoughts to find some semblance of clarity. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, precisely the solitude I craved. My Uncle Nathan, with a knowing, somber tone, always spoke of the property possessing good bones but bad history. An old-timer, he explained, had sold it to him for a pittance after his brother had mysteriously vanished while hunting in the 50s. I had been there 4 days already, mostly consumed by the simple rhythms of fishing and reading, when a compelling urge seized me to explore a section of the property I had never truly investigated before. This marshy expanse where the ground remained perpetually soft, treacherous, even in the driest weather. The morning commenced with an unremarkable normalcy. Coffee at sunrise, eggs and toast, the usual comforting routine of living rough. Around 9, I shouldered my hiking pack and headed toward the marsh. A vague notion of finding promising spots for duck hunting come fall. The terrain out there was notoriously treacherous, an insidious labyrinth of small, hidden pools of standing water, deceptively concealed beneath layers of moss and grass that appeared solid until one's foot sank into the cold, black muck. Approximately 40 minutes into my arduous trek, my boot caught on something metallic, something stubbornly protruding from the boggy, yielding ground. Initially, I dismissed it as old farming equipment, a common relic found scattered across Alaska from abandoned homesteads. But as I bent down to free my boot, I saw it was aluminum, not the rusted iron one would expect from forgotten farm tools. The piece was perhaps 2 feet long, twisted and partially buried with what appeared to be rivet holes along one edge. The metal bore an odd, unsettling greenish patina, not quite corrosion, but something more akin to the unique transformation that occurs in aircraft aluminum after decades submerged in acidic soil. I began to dig around the piece with my bare hands, tearing away decades of thick moss and black, fetid mud that reeked of rotting vegetation and a faint, unsettling hint of motor oil. The metal, to my surprise, extended far deeper than I had anticipated, connected to a larger section that was bent at an unnatural, grotesque angle, as if subjected to an impact of tremendous cataclysmic force. Numbers were faintly stamped into one section, AF, followed by digits I could not quite decipher, all corroded, yet undeniably bearing the hallmarks of military designation. I had seen enough military surplus in my time to recognize that. My grandfather, an Air Force veteran stationed at Alaskan back in the early 50s, had shown me old equipment with similar markings. The truly unsettling part was finding it here, in the utter middle of nowhere, on land that, according to county records my uncle had once shown me, had been private property since before World War II. I continued my excavation, utilizing a fallen branch as a makeshift shovel. And approximately 3 feet down, I struck something that stole my breath for a full, agonizing second. It was leather, miraculously preserved by the acidic bog water, still retaining its shape after all those years. A boot, unmistakably military issue, the kind with metal grommets and thick, unyielding soles used in the 40s and 50s. The leather had darkened to an almost black hue, yet the intricate stitching pattern remained faintly visible. Deep within the boot's toe, carefully pushed inside, was something wrapped in what might once have been oilcloth, but had mostly deteriorated into a waxy gray material. My fingers, numb from the cold, clinging mud, managed to peel away the fragile wrapping. Inside lay a small field journal, its pages fused together by moisture and time, and a tarnished silver wristwatch, its hands frozen eternally stopped at 2:17. The rational course of action would have been to immediately contact the authorities. But something, an inexplicable, morbid pull, compelled me to keep digging. Perhaps it was the way that boot had been so deliberately placed, not scattered haphazardly like crash debris, but positioned with a careful, unsettling intent, as if someone had hidden those items on purpose. Another hour of relentless digging unearthed more aluminum fragments, all bearing that same eerie green patina. And then, a discovery that made my chest tighten, a cold vice gripping my heart, a leather wallet, the kind with a chain attached, preserved like the boot yet split at the seams. Inside were plasticized cards, military identification, mostly ravaged by time, but I could make out part of a name. Sergeant J, something that began with M. The birth year was partially visible, 192x. There was a photograph too, shielded by a plastic covering depicting a young woman cradling a baby standing before a white clapboard house with a peaked roof. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had inscribed Betty, but the rest was lost to the cruel ravages of time. I sank back onto my heels, mud caking my arms up to the elbows, staring transfixed at these desolate remnants of someone's life, scattered in this silent bog. The sun had long since passed its zenith, and the shadows were lengthening, creeping like phantom limbs between the scraggly black spruce trees that bordered the marsh. That's when I noticed something else, a chilling pattern in the debris. The metal pieces were not randomly strewn. They formed a rough, discernible line, heading northeast, as if something immense had disintegrated in the air, its fragments scattering along a precise, terrifying trajectory. Following that line with my eyes, I could discern slight depressions in the moss, decades old, yet still visible if one knew precisely what to seek. I began walking in that direction, discovering more pieces every 20 or 30 feet. A twisted bracket here, a section of cable there, all of that same weathered aluminum adorned with military-grade fittings. Approximately 200 yards from where I had found the boot, the ground dipped into a natural hollow, filled with standing water the color of weak, murky tea. The water in that hollow was perhaps knee-deep, and through its dark surface I could vaguely discern the outline of something massive just beneath. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I waded into the cold water, which instantly flooded my boots, a shocking, icy embrace. It was a section of a fuselage, about 15 feet of it, broken open like a shattered eggshell, yet still unmistakably recognizable as aircraft structure. The metal skin bore those distinctive riveted panels one sees on old military transports. Inside, everything organic had long since vanished, consumed by the bog, but the aluminum frame members and seat brackets remained, grotesquely twisted and compressed from the unimaginable force of impact. On one intact section of the interior wall, I could faintly make out stenciled letters, "No step," and below that partially obscured USF, followed by numbers I could not decipher. The cargo area displayed heavy-duty tie-down points, robustly welded to the floor, far more substantial than anything required for regular supplies or personnel transport. Whatever this ill-fated plane had been carrying, it had been incredibly heavy and required serious, desperate securing. What truly solidified the chill in my bones, though, was finding the jacket. It was wool, dark blue, caught on a jagged piece of metal near what would have been the rear of the fuselage section. Air Force issue from that grim era, with the sergeant's stripe still faintly visible on the sleeve. The name tape was there too, faded but legible. Morrison. In the chest pocket, encased in a rubber pouch that had miraculously remained watertight, was a folded set of orders. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but I could clearly read the date, January 15th, 1950. The text was largely standard military jargon about transport duties, but one line, cold and stark, leaped out at me. Classified cargo pursuant to operation. And then a thick black redaction bar applied with ink not printed that way. A deliberate act of concealment. Below that, coordinates that matched almost exactly where I was standing. Except these were not marked as a final destination. They were chillingly designated as Checkpoint Alpha, with a final destination of Ellendorf Air Force Base. I was so utterly consumed by deciphering those orders that I did not hear the helicopter until it was practically upon me. The sound, a distinctive rhythmic thump, 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 came fast, echoing off the silent hills. And when I looked up, a white and blue civilian Sentinel helicopter was circling low, perhaps 300 feet up. No discernible markings save for a registration number. It executed 2 tight circles, and I could clearly see someone in the passenger seat, holding what appeared to be a camera or binoculars pointed directly at me. Then, as abruptly as it had materialized, it banked hard and headed southeast, vanishing toward Fairbanks. The entire chilling encounter lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but every hair on my neck stood rigid with a primal alarm. In 20 years of visiting this property, I had never witnessed an aircraft fly that low over this area. Save for the occasional bush plane heading to the remote villages up north, and those never circled with such predatory intent. I frantically grabbed everything I could carry, the journal, the watch, the wallet, the orders, and stuffed them into my pack, then began a desperate, hurried retreat back toward the cabin. The sun was sinking low. Perhaps 3 hours of light remaining, and I kept casting anxious glances at the sky every few seconds. My mind raced, consumed by the chilling implications. This crash site had lain undiscovered for over 70 years on private land, and within mere hours of my finding it, someone was already surveying the area. By the time I stumbled back to the cabin, my shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool evening air. I locked the door, a precaution I never took out there, and spread the items on the kitchen table, a macabre display of forgotten history. That's when I noticed something I had initially missed. The field journal's pages were fused, but the edges bore faint writing, and one partial sentence was eerily visible. Cargo is reactive too. And then, nothing. The next visible fragment read, men showing symptoms of, and the rest was hopelessly destroyed by water damage. Around 8 that evening, I heard vehicles approaching up the access road, multiple engines, heavy ones, a symphony of encroaching dread. Through the window, I saw 3 black SUVs pull up. No government plates, but that unmistakable, chilling federal look. 6 people emerged, all clad in outdoor gear, appearing deceptively like mere hikers or hunters. But the way they moved, with a coordinated, purposeful precision, was profoundly unsettling. The man who knocked on my door was probably 50, with gray hair and a military cut, his friendly smile a cold, artificial mask that never quite reached his eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Carlson from the Arctic Environmental Preservation Initiative, AEPI. He stated they had received reports of possible contamination in the area, old military waste from Cold War operations. Did I know anything about that? Had I noticed any unusual debris, any metal fragments, anything that seemed out of place? His tone was deceptively casual, but 2 of his colleagues were already meticulously walking the perimeter of the cabin, and I saw one talking into a radio, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. I played dumb, feigning ignorance, claiming I had merely been fishing, had seen nothing unusual. Carlson nodded, then handed me a business card with only a phone number. No agency logo, no address. He instructed me that if I remembered anything or found anything unusual, I should call immediately, warning that some old military materials could be hazardous even after all these years. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, if I had taken any photos that day, perhaps for social media. anything that might help them identify contamination areas. When I replied in the negative, he smiled again, a cold, empty gesture, and suggested they would be conducting a survey of the area over the next few days, implying it might be safer if I headed back to town until they completed their assessment. It wasn't technically an order, but the way he said it, the way those other 5 shadowy figures stood arrayed around my cabin, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had no choice. I packed up that very night, and as I drove out, I saw lights flickering through the dense trees heading toward the marsh. Many lights, a whole operation mobilizing in the encroaching darkness. I kept the items, those grim relics of a forgotten tragedy. I still possess them. I drove straight through to Anchorage that night, securing them in a safety deposit box before checking into an anonymous motel. The next morning, I called my Uncle Nathan to inform him about the AEPI inspection at his property. He fell silent for a long, unsettling moment, then uttered words that sent a profound chill through my very blood. His brother, the one who had mysteriously disappeared hunting in the 50s, had been found 3 weeks after going missing, dead from what they officially called exposure. But Nathan's father, a man of stubborn conviction, never believed it. The body had borne strange, inexplicable burns on the hands and face, hair falling out in clumps, symptoms the local doctor couldn't explain, yet explicitly instructed the family not to discuss. The death certificate, a cold clinical lie, simply stated exposure and dehydration. Nathan's father had spent years, a lifetime, futilely seeking answers, writing to the Air Force, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen, always asking about what had transpired in January 1950, about what had fell from the sky that winter. He had never received a single response, only chilling visits from federal agents, subtly warning him to stop asking questions for his family's safety. 2 weeks later, I returned to inspect the site. The entire marsh area had been excavated down to bedrock, perhaps 3 acres completely stripped bare, a gaping wound in the earth. Fresh gravel had been trucked in, the ground meticulously leveled and compacted, as if preparing for some vast, unseen construction. New no trespassing environmental remediation area signs were posted every 50 feet, official-looking, emblazoned with AEPI logos and stark warning symbols. But here was the most chilling detail. I searched the API's contamination database when I returned home. There was no record, no trace of any cleanup operation at those coordinates. No environmental assessment, no hazardous waste site designation, nothing. I called the number on Carlson's card once using a payphone at a desolate truck stop. It rang twice, then a disembodied voice simply said, "Yes." When I inquired about Mr. Carlson, the line went dead, a sudden chilling silence. The number was disconnected when I tried again an hour later. I still check online sometimes, searching for any mention of that ill-fated 1950 flight, cross-referencing the names Morrison and Betty with missing aircraft reports. Every few months, a link I've painstakingly bookmarked goes dead. A database entry inexplicably disappears. Another piece of the chilling puzzle gets scrubbed away. But I kept those items, and sometimes I pull them out and gaze at that faded photograph of Betty and her baby, wondering if they ever truly knew what happened. If they are still out there somewhere, growing old now, still waiting for answers about why their father never came home. Story 2. The Sentinels of Boulder Point. The research station on San Nicolas Island rationed its running water, a precious commodity, for a mere 2 hours each morning. I had just endured my cold, bracing shower when Dr. Harrison's urgent knock rattled my door, bringing with it news that would irrevocably alter everything. It was the summer of 2001, and I, at 26, fresh from my marine biology PhD program at UC San Diego, was embarking on my first true field assignment, meticulously studying pinniped behavior off the rugged California coast. The island itself, a desolate, unforgiving stretch of volcanic rock and resilient coastal scrub, barely extended 3 miles. A small facility housed 6 researchers during the peak breeding season, our solitary outpost against the vast, indifferent ocean. We diligently monitored various sea lion colonies, scattered like dark jewels across the rocky shores, meticulously documenting mating patterns, pup survival rates, and the brutal territorial battles between the massive roaring bulls. The work was grueling, soul-sapping, yet exhilarating, precisely the life I had envisioned during all those years confined to windowless, sterile labs. No one openly discussed Dr. Jennifer Lawson, the researcher who had mysteriously vanished the previous year during a routine observation. Yet her untouched field notebook remained on the common room shelf, a silent, unsettling warning, a testament to her disappearance. The official report, a flimsy veil over a chilling truth, attributed her loss to rough seas and aggressive wildlife, though the details remained frustratingly, chillingly vague. That particular morning in early July began with an equipment malfunction that, in hindsight, should have been my first stark warning to steer clear of Boulder Point. My radio had been crackling with persistent static throughout the long, dark night, and when I attempted to check in with base camp at 5 a.m., all I received was this weird, rhythmic interference pattern, a sound almost like labored breathing through a broken speaker, a ghost in the machine. The Western Rookery was my assigned observation post for the day. A treacherous landscape of about 300 sea lions packed tightly onto a series of flat, jagged rocks that jutted out into the Pacific like broken, ancient teeth. Reaching it demanded a 40-minute hike along narrow, winding cliff paths that became treacherously slick when wet from the pervasive morning fog. I had made the arduous trek dozens of times that season, but something felt profoundly different as I loaded my gear into my backpack. The bulls had been unusually aggressive lately, their monstrous forms charging much farther inland than typical, with several researchers reporting unsettlingly close calls. One massive bull in particular, tagged as M47, had developed an unnerving habit of tracking our movements from the water, his scarred head breaking the surface wherever we established our blinds. He possessed a damaged left eye, a milky clouded orb from some ancient injury, and the way he would relentlessly track us with his good eye, while that dead one stared blindly ahead, unsettled everyone to their core. Dr. Harrison had specifically tasked me with collecting tissue samples from any deceased pups I might find, a grim yet necessary aspect of understanding mortality patterns within the colony. The preservation kit, a heavy, cold burden, added an extra 15 pounds to my pack. I remember incessantly adjusting the straps, the weight pressing down on me as I meticulously made my way down the volcanic rock trail. The fog was thicker than usual, a suffocating milky shroud reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet, and the cacophony of the colony grew louder, more ominous with each switchback turn. You could hear them before you saw them, a deafening symphony of deep, guttural bellows, piercing high-pitched barks, and the occasional thunderous splash as a bull launched himself into the churning surf. The smell assaulted me next, that distinctive, overpowering mix of fish, sharp ammonia, and wet fur that seasoned researchers barely noticed anymore but still made newcomers gag. I had learned out of grim necessity to breathe through my mouth on approach, though the metallic, fishy taste was hardly an improvement. As I finally reached the observation blind, a small, crude wooden structure we had constructed behind some larger rocks, I immediately noticed an unsettling detail. Someone had been there very recently. Fresh boot prints in the damp sand led from the blind down toward the water's edge, a profoundly strange occurrence as I had the only scheduled observation for that day. The prints were small, perhaps a woman's size 7, and they bore a distinctive wear pattern on the heel that looked disturbingly familiar. I followed them with meticulous care, staying well clear of the bull's invisible yet rigidly observed territorial markers. Boundaries that, if transgressed, would trigger an 800-pound charge you could not possibly outrun. The tracks led to a flat section of beach where we sometimes discovered dead pups washed ashore after violent storms. But what I found there, half buried in the sand, made me stop breathing for several agonizing seconds. Dr. Lawson's equipment bag, the one that had supposedly been lost with her 10 months ago, was wedged tightly between two rocks just above the tide line. The canvas was bleached pale from relentless sun exposure and stiff with dried salt, but her initials, JL, were still faintly visible in faded black marker. Inside, her waterproof field notebook had remarkably survived largely intact, though something had torn deep, savage gouges through the cover, leaving parallel scratches that sliced cleanly through 30 pages, a testament to a violent struggle. The final entry, chillingly dated the day she disappeared, contained measurements and behavioral notes that seemed routine until the last paragraph, where her usually neat handwriting became increasingly erratic, a frantic scrawl. M47, displaying unprecedented territorial expansion, she had scrawled, the letters growing larger, more jagged with each word. Followed me 200+ meters inland. Coordination with other bulls. They're moving in patterns that don't match any documented behavior. Christine saw it too, but Harrison dismisses concerns. The juveniles won't enter the water when M47 is near. They know something. The entry abruptly cut off mid-sentence with a long, desperate ink streak trailing off the page, as if she had been violently interrupted mid-thought, mid-warning. I photographed each page with shaking fingers, a desperate attempt to document everything before I could decide my next terrifying course of action. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to pack up immediately, to hike back to base and present Harrison with this chilling evidence. But those fresh boot prints, undeniably recent, nagged at me. Someone had been here within the last few hours, perhaps even this very morning, and had departed, leaving this damning evidence behind. As I stood there, paralyzed, puzzling over the terrifying timeline, a sudden, profound silence descended upon the colony. If you have never experienced 300 sea lions falling completely silent simultaneously, it is the kind of wrongness that makes your primitive brain scream desperate warnings. A primal, ancient terror. I turned slowly toward the rookery and saw something that, according to everything I had ever learned about pinniped behavior, should not have been possible. The bulls had formed a perfect semicircle at the water's edge, all facing the same direction, inland, toward where I stood. M47, a monstrous sentinel, was at the very center, that milky, dead eye catching the morning sun through the thinning fog, his massive head lowered in what appeared, chillingly, to be a hunting posture. The females and pups had retreated to the furthest, most sheltered rocks, huddled together in tight, trembling groups, their usual boisterous barking replaced by low, anxious, rumbling sounds of profound fear. In 15 years of meticulously studying marine mammals, I had never witnessed anything remotely similar to this coordinated, terrifying positioning. My hand moved instinctively to the radio clipped to my belt, but all I received was that same rhythmic static, the ghost of a breath when I attempted to call base. The bulls began to move then, not the typical aggressive, chaotic rushing one would expect, but this slow, deliberate, unnerving advance up the beach, meticulously maintaining their perfect, menacing formation. They covered ground with a surprising, almost unnatural coordination, using their powerful front flippers to haul their immense bulk forward, while their back flippers provided an eerie stability. The preservation kit in my backpack contained a flare gun for emergencies, and I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy with terror as I backed slowly, desperately toward the cliff path. Rule number 1 in wildlife research: never run from a predator. But these creatures were not acting like predators. They moved with the patient, relentless inevitability of something that knew its prey had nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. 30 meters separated us when I fired the flare into the oppressive air. The bright, shocking red burst was momentarily visible through the lifting fog, a fleeting beacon of futile hope. The sound, a sharp crack, should have startled them, sent them scrambling back to the relative safety of the water in typical pinniped fashion. Instead, they merely paused for perhaps 3 agonizing seconds, then resumed their relentless advance, an unstoppable tide of terror. M47 emitted a sound I had never heard from a sea lion before, something between a guttural growl and a wet, sickening clicking, and the other bulls seemed to respond to it, adjusting their position slightly. An unspoken, chilling communication. My grandfather, who had fought in Korea, once recounted how the enemy would employ psychological tactics, coordinated movements meticulously designed to shatter morale long before physical contact. Watching those bulls advance with such unnatural precision, such strategic, chilling intent, reminded me with a sickening jolt of his terrifying stories. Except these were animals, creatures that by all biological understanding should not have been capable of that level of strategic thought. The cliff path was a mere 10 meters behind me when I heard the splash. Not the chaotic, frantic splashing of animals entering water, but something deliberate, measured, chillingly precise. I risked a desperate glance back toward the ocean and saw more bulls emerging from the churning surf, effectively cutting off any possible escape route along the beach. They moved to flank the first group, creating what any military tactician would instantly recognize as a perfect, terrifying pincer movement. That's when I noticed the bones scattered among the rocks near the water's edge, too large to be from fish, too weathered to identify clearly, yet arranged in small, unsettling piles that looked deliberately placed. A macabre altar. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing more of the horror, and in the improved visibility I could see scratch marks on the volcanic rocks leading up from the beach, deep, savage gouges that followed the exact paths the bulls were now taking. These were not random territorial markings, they formed clear ancient routes worn down by repeated methodical use. My mind raced, a frantic, desperate scramble through possibilities, attempting to construct some shred of sense from the incomprehensible tableau I was witnessing, when I heard human footsteps on the path above me. Relief, a dizzying, momentary surge flooded through me until I saw who it was. Christine Garrett, another researcher who had supposedly departed for the mainland 2 days prior due to a family emergency. Her clothes were filthy, caked in what appeared to be dried algae and sand, and her hair hung in salt-stiffened clumps around her blank, vacant face. But it was her expression that made my stomach clench, a profound, sickening unease, utterly blank, as if she were sleepwalking with her eyes wide open. She moved down the path toward me with a mechanical, unsettling precision, her bare feet seemingly unbothered by the sharp, jagged volcanic rocks. Behind her I heard more footsteps, and within moments 2 more figures emerged from the thinning fog. Dr. Phillips and Mark Reeves, both researchers who had been reported missing from other monitoring stations along the California coast over the past 18 months. They all shared that same vacant stare, their movements synchronized in a chilling, unnatural way that perfectly matched the bull's menacing formation below. Christine's mouth opened, and she produced a sound that was not quite human. It was that same clicking growl M47 had emitted, except emanating from human vocal cords. It sounded broken, wrong, an abomination. The bulls responded immediately, shifting their formation to create an opening, a clear, silent path that led directly to the water's edge, where the piles of bone lay waiting, a horrifying invitation. The realization struck me with brutal, sickening clarity. Jennifer Lawson had not drowned, nor had she been killed by aggressive wildlife. She was probably out there somewhere, just like Christine and the others, existing in some unimaginable nightmare, trapped between human and something else entirely. The preserved tissue samples in my pack suddenly took on a different, more terrifying meaning. Perhaps Harrison knew exactly what horrifying events were unfolding here and desperately needed proof before anyone would ever believe it. I scrambled up a steep section of rocks, ignoring how the sharp volcanic surface tore through my pants, leaving bloody raw scratches on my palms. The three researchers followed with an inhuman, relentless persistence, never speeding up or slowing down, maintaining that steady, purposeful, horrifying pace. Above them, I heard the familiar thud of a helicopter approaching. The supply run wasn't scheduled for another week, which meant someone at base had miraculously received my flare signal after all. The bulls below began retreating toward the water, their menacing formation dissolving as quickly as it had formed, reverting to typical sea lion behavior as if a hidden switch had been flipped, a horrifying illusion of normalcy. Christine and the others abruptly ceased their pursuit, standing perfectly still on the trail, their heads tilted at identical, unsettling angles as they listened to the approaching aircraft. The helicopter landed on the emergency pad near Boulder Point, and two Coast Guard officers leaped out, followed by Dr. Harrison himself. I ran toward them, waving frantically, desperately trying to form coherent words about the unspeakable horror I had just witnessed. But when I turned back to point at Christine and the others, they were gone. No trace of them on the trail. No footprints in the sand. Nothing. The bulls had dispersed across the rocks in normal resting positions, looking like any other sea lion colony on any other ordinary day. Harrison seized my shoulders, his face tight with an expression I could not decipher, his eyes dark with an unspoken dread. "Did you get the samples?" he asked, his voice urgent but tightly controlled. When I nodded, still gasping for breath, he immediately took my backpack, its contents now more precious than ever, and handed it to one of the officers. "We need to evacuate now," he declared, guiding me firmly toward the helicopter. "There's been an incident at the mainland facility. Contamination from the lab. We're shutting down all field stations." As the helicopter lifted off, its blades a roaring blur, I pressed my face to the window, watching the island shrink below us, a rapidly receding nightmare. For just a fleeting moment, I swear I saw them. At least a dozen figures standing waist-deep in the churning surf, utterly still, all facing our departing aircraft, silent, watchful sentinels. Harrison never permitted me to file an official report about what transpired that day. The program was indefinitely suspended, officially due to budgetary constraints following a laboratory contamination event. The tissue samples I had so desperately collected vanished into some bureaucratic void, and my persistent questions were met with increasingly stern warnings about the non-disclosure agreements I had signed, a legal leash around my truth. 6 months later, I found a different career path, teaching high school biology in Ohio, about as far from the ocean and that island as I could possibly get. But I kept Dr. Lawson's notebook. I had hidden it deep within my personal gear before Harrison could confiscate it. A small, defiant act. Every few years, I meticulously checked the marine biology journals, searching for any mention of unusual pinniped behavior or missing researchers along the Pacific coast. There are patterns if you know precisely what to seek. Stations that close abruptly, researchers who mysteriously transfer without notice, and always reports of unusually aggressive bull sea lions that witnesses describe as moving with an almost human, unsettling intelligence. The island remains off-limits, officially designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary, with all human access strictly forbidden. Sometimes I wonder if Christine and the others are still out there, standing in the cold, churning surf, silently waiting for the next unsuspecting research team to arrive. The last entry in Lawson's notebook, the one I never showed Harrison, was just 2 words: repeated over and over down an entire page, a chilling, desperate lament. They learn, they learn, they learn. Story 3. The Collector of the Solitary Trails. The storage room in our forensic lab basement, a place perpetually shrouded in an unnerving gloom, had always imbued everyone with a creeping sense of dread. But last Saturday, the true, chilling reason for that pervasive unease finally revealed itself to me. A truth that burrowed deep. I am 28, a grad student in forensic anthropology, and I'd been working here in Juneau for approximately 6 months, cataloging the unidentified remains for the state medical examiner's office. Most days were a monotonous blur of measuring bones, inputting data into sterile spreadsheets, and cross-referencing ancient dental records with missing persons reports that stretched back through decades. The meager pay covered the rent for my cramped downtown apartment, provided fodder for my dissertation, and rarely involved anything more disturbing than skeletal fragments and the faded, ghostly whispers of old paperwork. But that particular morning, a strange impulse compelled me to volunteer to organize the pre-1950 case files, an archive of forgotten sorrows, shoved into dark corners and neglected since a flood had ravaged half our archives in the distant 70s. No one else, it seemed, harbored the desire to contend with the water-stained, brittle pages and illegible scrawl. So the boxes remained, silent and growing, accumulating layers of mold and the thick, suffocating dust of forgotten tragedies. Armed with the sterile armor of latex gloves, a surgical mask, and enough scalding coffee to fuel a small aircraft, I descended into that narrow, mildew-scented room where the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered with the dying, erratic rhythm of trapped insects. The plan was disarmingly simple. Photograph what vestiges I could salvage, transcribe the legible fragments, and consign anything too damaged to preserve to the dustbin of history. Around noon, as I wrestled with a rusted filing cabinet, forcing it to yield its grip on the wall to access the boxes wedged behind it, I discovered a manila folder. It had apparently slipped between the cabinet and the wall decades ago, a silent, hidden testament. Its cover was dusted with mouse droppings and a thick, suffocating layer of dust, yet I could still discern the faded, ink-stained label, ML 1930 unresolved. Inside were brittle, sepia-toned photographs, typed witness statements on yellowing, fragile paper, and then a discovery that made me set down my coffee, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. It was a hand-drawn map of hiking trails near Juneau, crisscrossed with ominous X marks, each meticulously annotated with dates ranging from 1930 to 1978, accompanied by initials that belonged to no investigator I had ever heard of within our department. The photograph depicted a young woman with dark hair, meticulously pinned in the distinct, elegant wave style of the 1920s. She wore a wool hiking skirt and sturdy boots, her smile radiating a genuine warmth that made her seem unsettlingly alive, even through the aged, faded paper. Mary Theth, the case notes revealed, was a 22-year-old elementary school teacher who had vanished during a solo hike on a trail still frequented by locals today. The official report painted a chilling picture. Searchers had discovered her belongings folded with an almost obsessive precision beside the trail. Her jacket, a stark, perfect square, her boots placed precisely parallel, laces tucked neatly inside, her rucksack emptied, its contents meticulously organized by size. No signs of struggle, no telltale blood, no torn clothing, just her possessions, arranged with a meticulous, unsettling care like a macabre display. And Mary herself, utterly vanished into the vast, indifferent Alaskan wilderness. Lieutenant James Brennan, the investigating officer, noted with a profound unease that the scene appeared staged with deliberate care. He mentioned interviewing a trapper named Silas Holbrook, who claimed to have seen Mary conversing with someone near the trailhead, though he could offer no description beyond the person wearing city clothes. But it was the map, more than anything, that burrowed deep under my skin, for those X marks were not random, chaotic scribbles. They formed a chillingly precise pattern along specific elevations, all nestled between 800 and 1,000 feet, all within a 3-mile radius of where Mary's meticulously arranged belongings were found. Beside each X lay initials and dates: EP 1933, LM 1941, DK 1955, and so on, the most recent being AJ 1978. I cross-referenced those dates with our missing persons database on my laptop, my fingers growing clumsy and cold as I typed, and discovered a truth that made the basement's already oppressive air feel suddenly 10 degrees colder. Every single date corresponded to a missing hiker in the Juneau area. Not just any hikers, but specifically women, aged between 20 and 30, all described as hiking alone, all whose belongings were found neatly arranged, their bodies never to surface. 48 years of disappearances meticulously documented on a map hidden within Mary Thies's file, drawn by someone who possessed knowledge of these cases even before some of them were officially reported to the police. I should have, by all rational accounts, delivered the file directly to my supervisor, logged it as evidence, and allowed the proper channels to handle this chilling discovery. But something, a morbid curiosity, an irresistible pull, compelled me to dig deeper into that forgotten box behind the filing cabinet. Beneath layers of water-damaged reports, I unearthed a leather journal, the kind with a strap closure that had long since rotted away. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with neat, precise handwriting and fountain pen ink. The first entry, dated May 1930, bore the signature of Silas Holbrook, the same trapper interviewed about Mary Thies. My mouth went impossibly dry as I devoured his entries, each one describing with clinical, dispassionate detail his observations of female hikers on the trails, their routines, their habits, which ones ventured alone, their typical starting times, their preferred resting spots. He chronicled Mary Thies for 3 weeks before her disappearance, noting her Sunday hikes after church, always on the same trail, always pausing at the same spot to eat lunch. A clearing with a panoramic view of the valley, approximately 1,000 feet in elevation. The journal entries continued for decades, the handwriting subtly shifting as Holbrook aged, yet the obsessive, meticulous documentation never ceased. He described his collection process in euphemistic terms that made bile rise in my throat, how he would preserve certain hikers who met his criteria, how he would arrange their belongings, a macabre memorial to their beauty, how he would transport them to his private sanctuary in the mountains. In 1978, the entries abruptly ceased. Mid-sentence, the pen seemingly dropped while still inscribing. I flipped through the remaining blank pages and found a folded piece of newspaper tucked into the back cover. An obituary for Silas Holbrook, dated September 1978, describing him as a respected outdoorsman and guide who had died of a heart attack at age 73. He was survived by his grandson, Michael Holbrook, who had recently returned to Juneau after college to take over his grandfather's guide business. My laptop screen, neglected, had gone dark from inactivity, and in its black reflective surface I caught a fleeting glimpse of movement behind me. I spun around with such frantic speed that I knocked over my thermos, hot coffee spreading like a dark, viscous stain across the concrete floor. But the doorway was empty, a chilling void. The fluorescent light above me buzzed and flickered, casting shifting, dancing shadows into the oppressive corners of the room. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 3:47 p.m., and noted with a sudden, sharp pang of dread that I had no signal down in the basement, a common occurrence, yet one that suddenly felt deeply, intensely threatening. I began photographing the journal pages with shaking hands, the camera flash illuminating the cramped, suffocating space in harsh, blinding bursts. Each flash seemed to make the shadows jump and dance with malevolent glee, and I kept hearing sounds from the hallway. Footsteps, perhaps, or merely the ancient building settling, its timbers groaning. I desperately tried to convince myself that I was succumbing to paranoia, that reading the diary of a serial killer would unnerve anyone. But then, I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of the stairwell door opening, one floor above me. The footsteps were deliberate and measured, the heavy tread of work boots on cold concrete descending inexorably toward the basement. We had no weekend security, and I hadn't seen any other cars in the parking lot when I had arrived that morning. The steps paused at the basement door, and I heard the handle turn slowly, methodically, metal grinding against metal, a sound that grated on my raw nerves. I shoved the journal and map into my backpack, my heart hammering so violently I could feel its frantic beat in my throat. The door opened, and a man stepped into the hallway. Tall, probably in his mid-50s, he wore a Forest Service uniform that looked authentic, yet subtly wrong, as if it had been preserved in storage for far too long. He possessed pale gray eyes and a face weathered by years spent outdoors, etched with the lines of relentless exposure. When he smiled, it was the practiced, unsettling smile of someone who had painstakingly learned to mimic human warmth without ever truly feeling it. "You must be the new researcher," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "I'm Michael Holbrook. My company maintains the trails around here, and we work closely with the medical examiner's office on recovery operations. I heard someone was finally going through the old files." He walked into the storage room without a shred of invitation, his boots leaving wet, dark prints on the concrete floor, even though it hadn't rained that day. The smell hit me then, a sickening olfactory assault, pine sap, sharply acrid, and something else beneath it, something chemical and sharp, like the faint, sickening scent of formaldehyde. He positioned himself between me and the door, a physical barrier, his gaze sweeping over the boxes and files I had been sorting. His eyes lingered with an unnerving intensity on the empty space behind the filing cabinet, the exact spot where I had unearthed the journal. "Found anything interesting?" he asked, moving closer, and I saw with a fresh wave of revulsion the dirt under his fingernails, the kind that becomes so deeply embedded it seems to merge with the very skin. I managed to stammer something about water damage and illegible records, my backpack suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, a leaden weight on my shoulder. He reached past me with a slow, deliberate movement to pick up one of the photographs from Mary Thie's file that I had left on the table. He held it with a reverence that turned my stomach, a gesture both tender and profoundly unsettling. "My grandfather knew her," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "Told me stories about all the hikers from back then. Said the mountain takes who it wants and we shouldn't question its choices." I tried to edge subtly toward the door, but he shifted his weight, imperceptibly yet effectively, still blocking my escape. "The thing about these old cases," he continued, setting down the photograph with deliberate, almost ritualistic care, "is that people today don't understand how different things were back then. No GPS, no cell phones, no emergency beacons. A person could vanish, and it wouldn't be anybody's fault. Just nature taking its course." His fingers traced the edge of the table, leaving a faint, disturbing streak of dirt. "My grandfather taught me everything about these trails. Every hidden path, every cave, every place where the earth opens up and swallows what it's given." The way he emphasized special spots made my skin prickle with a sudden, icy wave of goosebumps. He had his special spots, places he'd take people who really wanted to understand the wilderness. He passed that knowledge to me before he died. Family legacy, you could say. Michael then pulled out his phone and displayed a photo. Himself, standing with a group of young women in hiking gear, all smiling brightly at the camera, dated just last month. "I run guided tours now. very popular with tourists, especially solo female travelers looking for an authentic Alaskan experience, he said, his smile a chilling facade. The storage room seemed to shrink, to press in on me with each passing second, the walls themselves closing. The fluorescent light casting his shadow across the doorway like a physical, insurmountable barrier. I forced myself to stare at the photo on his phone, frantically memorizing the faces of those women, wondering with a cold dread if they had all made it home safely. "That's nice," I managed to croak, my voice cracking, fragile. "I should probably get going, though." Lost track of time down here. I began gathering random papers, shoving them blindly into a box, a desperate, clumsy attempt to appear busy and normal, even as every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee. Michael didn't move, a static, terrifying presence. "You know what's funny?" he said, pulling a worn leather wallet from his pocket. "My grandfather kept detailed records too. Guest logs, trail reports, that sort of thing. Very thorough man." He opened the wallet, revealing a small folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. He even kept a list of researchers who showed too much interest in certain cases, updated it right until the day he died. He began to unfold the paper slowly with agonizing deliberation, and I caught a horrifying glimpse of names written in that same fountain pen ink I had seen in the journal. Before he could utter another word, voices erupted from upstairs, multiple people laughing and talking loudly. The weekend cleaning crew, I realized, with an overwhelming, almost dizzying wave of relief, their cartwheels squeaking a cheerful, discordant symphony as they rolled down the hallway above us. Michael's expression shifted, the practiced mask of friendliness cracking for a fleeting moment, revealing something cold, calculating and predatory beneath. He folded the paper, tucking it back into his wallet, and then, with a subtle, fluid motion, stepped aside from the doorway. "Looks like you have company," he said, his tone light, yet his eyes never left mine, holding me in their chilling grip. "I should let you get back to work, but hey, if you ever want to see those trails Mary Thieth hiked, I'd be happy to show you. I know exactly where they found her things. My grandfather showed me the spot when I was 12. Said it was important to remember." He reached into his pocket and placed a business card on the table, his muddy fingers leaving a dark, disturbing smear across the pristine white cardstock. "Think about it. Some places in Alaska, you really need a guide who knows the family history." He walked out then, his footsteps echoing, reverberating up the stairs, leaving me paralyzed, clutching my backpack, the journal and map pressed, a cold weight against my ribs through the fabric. I waited, my breath held until I heard the cleaning crew directly outside the basement door before I bolted up the stairs, nodding at them as casually as my shaking legs would allow. In the parking lot, Michael's truck was gone. A phantom disappearance, but fresh tire tracks in the mud, stark and undeniable, showed he had circled the building twice before finally departing. I drove straight to the Juneau Police Department, my hands trembling violently on the steering wheel, my gaze constantly flicking to my mirrors, searching for any sign of that truck. Detective Grace Navarro, the woman on duty, listened to my frantic story with growing concern, especially when I presented her with the photos I had taken of the journal. Within an hour, a team had descended upon the storage facility, meticulously collecting everything from that basement room, every scrap of evidence. Grace informed me that they had been investigating a series of missing hikers from the past 5 years. All women, all solo travelers who had chillingly taken guided tours before vanishing on subsequent solo hikes. The guide company's name on the permits, Wildwood Ascent Guides. They had never possessed enough concrete evidence to secure a warrant, but the journal, a silent, damning testament, had irrevocably altered everything. They arrested Michael Holbrook 3 days later at his cabin 40 miles outside Juneau. a secluded, sinister place accessible only by helicopter or a hidden trail his grandfather had carved through the mountains in the 1940s. The search team unearthed personal items from 17 women in an underground storage space beneath the cabin. Jewelry, driver's licenses, hiking boots, all meticulously cataloged with dates and initials matching missing persons reports stretching back to 1979, the year after Silas died. They also discovered human remains chillingly preserved in industrial freezers, though I was assured those macabre details would be withheld from the public during the trial. Michael had, with a chilling dedication, continued his grandfather's grotesque work for 46 years, selecting victims from his tours, studying their habits, then intercepting them on solo hikes months later, when no one would possibly connect him to their inexplicable disappearances. The prosecutor declared the journal to be the pivotal evidence that had shattered the case. Without it, they might never have comprehended the full, horrifying scope of what the Holbrooks had perpetrated. As for Mary Theth and the other lost souls from Silas's era, search teams are still meticulously combing those mountain trails, employing ground-penetrating radar around the elevations marked on that chilling map. They have so far discovered 4 burial sites, and the relentless search continues. I completed my work in Juneau and last month retreated to Washington. But sometimes I still awaken, haunted by the memory of Michael's pale gray eyes and that practiced hollow smile, wondering how many unsuspecting souls saw it, trusted it, just before they vanished into his grandfather's terrifying special places. Story 4. The descent into the Arctic vein. Before the descent, a chill seizes you, colder than the Alaskan air itself. Forget the usual pleas to like and subscribe. What truly matters is the story, a chilling whisper from the vast, unforgiving north. Now let the darkness claim you. The Arctic Vein Minerals facility in the unforgiving expanse of Alaska was desperately seeking safety inspectors, offering double the standard remuneration. Yet no one in the desolate mining town would utter a single word to explain why such a lucrative offer was extended. I, then a raw 26-year-old on the cusp of October in 2008, was barely treading water, drowning in the suffocating depths of student debt from mining school. My engineering degree, a once shining beacon of hope, had become almost worthless in the grips of an economy in freefall. Vernon, the recruiter, possessed a chillingly disconcerting presence. One of his eyes, a lifeless glass orb, perpetually wandered, while the other, the living one, remained unnervingly fixated on you, a gaze that burrowed deep. He kept reiterating, almost with a low, guttural warning disguised as casual conversation, the sheer, crushing remoteness of the site. With the tips of his fingers, he nudged a contract across the cold, unyielding desk, never quite making full contact with the paper for more than a fleeting second. He informed me, his voice devoid of warmth, that a minimum 6-month commitment was mandatory. No exceptions, he stressed, no matter what unsettling sights or sounds I might encounter. The compensation, a sum substantial enough to obliterate my towering loans and then some, promised an escape, a final liberation from the suffocating confines of my parents' basement, where I'd been merely existing since the hollow victory of graduation. As my hand, steady yet trembling, scrawled my signature, Vernon's living eye twitched, a minuscule betrayal of his composure. He mumbled something indistinct, a low, rasping sound about fervently hoping I would prove to be unlike the others who had come before. The mining settlement itself seemed to cling precariously to the mountainside, a desperate, reluctant parasite. Its buildings, stained with the rust-colored tears of time, loomed crookedly, their ancient walkways groaning and creaking under every step, a skeletal chorus of protest. On my very first morning, a creeping unease settled over me as I observed the work crews heading into the cavernous tunnels. They moved with an unsettling uniformity in tight, almost claustrophobic formations, shoulders brushing, no man daring to stray more than an arm's length from the next, as if bound by an invisible, chilling tether. Craig, my assigned roommate, was a hulking drill operator with forearms like gnarled oak, whose obsession manifested in meticulously organizing baseball cards by year and player statistics, creating sprawling, intricate spreadsheets that consumed our kitchen table. He chewed tobacco incessantly, a habit punctuated by the wet, rhythmic spit he deposited into an array of old soup cans precisely lined along the windowsill. He also harbored a peculiar, unnerving ritual, counting the miners as they vanished into the tunnels each morning, then again when they surfaced pale and silent for lunch, and once more with a chilling precision at the end of their shift. When I, with a hesitant voice, inquired about this peculiar tally, he simply grunted that management's records were notoriously unreliable, and it fell to someone, some unseen, unburdened soul, to ensure that every man who descended into the earth clawed his way back out. On my third day, the chill deepened when I was assigned to inspect Tunnel 7, accompanied by two veteran miners, Frank and Eduardo. Frank, a gaunt, weathered man, had toiled in these mines for 11 years, a tenure that, according to the hushed whispers of the other men, made him something of a living miracle. He possessed a peculiar, almost ritualistic habit of tapping the tunnel walls every few feet with a ball-peen hammer he carried everywhere, a constant rhythmic thud against the stone. It wasn't for structural integrity, he explained, his voice low and gravelly, but to announce their presence, to let anyone or anything in the deeper shafts know we were coming through. A phrase that sent a shiver down my spine. Eduardo, younger but already etched with the deep lines of 5 years spent underground, adjusted the brightness of his headlamp with an unsettling obsessiveness, clicking it from high to high again in patterns that felt disturbingly deliberate, a silent, flickering language. They forbade me from walking between them, insisting I remain at the rear where both their gazes could encompass me. And each time we passed one of the ancient tunnel entrances, now sealed with crude concrete slabs, they would fall into a profound, suffocating silence, a morbid pact, until we had advanced at least 50 feet beyond its shadow. These sealed tunnels, silent concrete tombs, were everywhere once you ventured deep enough into the unforgiving heart of the mountain. Concrete slabs, stark and unyielding, bore stenciled dates that stretched back to the distant 1960s. Some were marked with official hazard signs, their warnings stark and clear, but others simply bore numbers and initials, offering no explanation for their permanent entombment. I unearthed a logbook in the safety office dating back to 1987, which chillingly alluded to structural instabilities in sections of the mine located far from any known fault lines or fragile rock formations. The pages covering September through November of that year had been violently ripped out, leaving only the ragged, torn edges clinging desperately to the binding. When I presented this macabre discovery to Briggs, my supervisor, a perpetually sweating man perpetually clad in the same stained flannel shirt, he snatched the book from my hands, mumbling that he would look into it. I never laid eyes on that logbook again, a silent, chilling void. It was then that I began meticulously recording my own observations, my dread-filled notes in a personal journal, a secret buried deep within the lining of my mattress. The incident that truly ruptured the thin veil of normalcy that set everything in motion occurred on a desolate Wednesday morning when the temperature plummeted to a bone-numbing 15 degrees. I was poring over equipment manifests in the suffocating quiet of the office when Craig burst through the door, his face a sickly pallor, the color of aged, yellowed newspaper. Tobacco juice, forgotten in his terror, dribbled unchecked down his chin. He seized my shoulders with a grip so fierce it promised bruises, repeating in a breathless, desperate litany that Tommy Fitzgerald's crew had not returned. They had descended into Tunnel 4 at 6 that morning, a routine copper vein assessment, a mere 3 men with standard gear. And now, the clock hands had crawled past noon. Duck, the ancient elevator operator, a Vietnamese man who wore his wife's rosary like a sacred ward around his neck, swore on all that was holy that he had never brought them back to the surface. But here was the detail that made my skin prickle, a cold wave of dread washing over me. Their names had been inexplicably crossed off the morning roster, as if their shift had been completed, their presence erased. And the handwriting, a sickening jolt, was an exact, precise match to Tommy's, down to the idiosyncratic curve of his T's. We hastily assembled a search party, though a disquieting truth became apparent. The veteran miners, their eyes haunted, conjured a flurry of desperate excuses to delay. One claimed faulty equipment, another insisted on filing urgent paperwork, a third suddenly recalled an urgent fabricated medical appointment. Eventually, it was just me, Craig, Frank, and two green, trembling rookies named Bradley and Kevin, who had only endured 3 months in this subterranean purgatory. The elevator's descent felt like a slow, agonizing plunge into the very throat of the earth, the cables groaning with a tortured metallic lament I had never heard before. When we finally reached Tunnel 4, Tommy's crew's equipment lay scattered near the entrance, a macabre still life. Their helmets eerily were arranged in a perfect triangle on the cold ground, headlamps still burning with a spectral glow, their beams pointing inward at each other as if in a silent, accusatory circle. Their tools lay nearby but twisted into shapes that defied all logic, a grotesque mockery of their original purpose. Drill bits contorted into impossible spirals, pickaxes with handles grotesquely wrapped around their own heads like metal serpents. Frank, with a sudden vice-like grip, seized my arm, his fingers digging in so fiercely I felt the pressure through my thick jacket, a silent warning. He pointed to the very spot where my next step would have landed. There, etched into the unyielding rock, were deep, savage gouges forming words that burned into my mind. "They make us dig ourselves out." The letters were jagged, a frantic testament to desperation, carved, judging by the dark, dried blood staining their grooves by fingernails. Bradley, a young, fragile thing, began to hyperventilate, his gasping cries echoing off the tunnel walls, magnified and distorted into a chorus of terror. Kevin, in a desperate backward scramble, retreated toward the elevator, whimpering that he needed to report this unspeakable horror to management immediately. But Craig, his voice a deadly, unnatural calm that was far more terrifying than a shout, blocked his escape. Management already knew, he explained, had always known. Reporting it, he hissed, would merely consign us to the same fate, making us the next crew to vanish into the Earth's hungry maw. It was then that we heard it, a rhythmic, chilling scraping emanating from deeper within the tunnel's suffocating depths, a metallic symphony of stone on metal, keeping perfect, relentless time, like a macabre metronome. The sound, raw and primal, tugged at something ancient within my brain, every instinct screaming, pleading, to run, to flee. But Frank was already moving, drawn by an unseen force, his hammer raised, a silent, archaic weapon. We followed, a procession of dread, because the alternative, splitting up, was a death sentence. A horrifying truth even the 3-month rookies instinctively understood in these lightless tunnels. About 200 feet in, the main shaft abruptly opened into a vast, impossible cavity, a void that existed on no map I had ever studied. The walls were too smooth, too perfectly circular, as if something monstrous had bored through the solid rock with an incredible, searing heat. And there, in the oppressive center, we found Tommy Fitzgerald. He stood alone, his back to us, perpetuating that chilling, scraping sound with what remained of a shovel. His clothes were shredded, reduced to hanging strips, and the skin beneath, exposed and raw, was marred by what appeared to be chemical burns. Perfect circles the size of quarters were etched all over his arms and neck, a horrifying constellation of agony. When Frank, His voice, barely a whisper, called his name. Tommy slowly turned. His eyes were gone, not gouged out, but utterly consumed, filled with a milky, opaque substance that had hardened, solidified like concrete. Tommy's mouth opened and closed in a grotesque parody of speech, but only a wet, sickening clicking sound escaped, like bones breaking, grinding underwater. He continued to scrape that shovel against the wall, a relentless, repetitive pattern. And then, a chilling realization. He was writing something, inscribing the same sequence of 5 numbers over and over again. 31785219. Craig, his face suddenly as pale as winter ash, recognized it first. He whispered, a breathy gasp of terror, that those were the employee ID numbers of miners who had vanished, swallowed by these very tunnels back in 1994. Tommy's hands never ceased their horrifying movement, even though the flesh was worn down to visible gleaming bone on his fingers. The shovel handle, an extension of his tormented form, was fused to his palms, somehow melted into the very skin like soft plastic. Behind him, deeper within that impossible cavity, we glimpsed the others from his crew, or what remained of them. They were partially embedded in the cold, unyielding walls, their bodies grotesquely twisted at angles that defied every law of anatomy. Their faces were pressed into the rock, yet they were still breathing, their chests rising and falling in an unnerving, synchronized rhythm. Bradley, overwhelmed by the sheer, unholy impossibility of it all, lost himself completely, screaming about how none of this could be real, how it defied all logic. And that's when the light began to fail. Not all at once, but in a horrifying sequence, like an unseen entity was moving toward us from the deeper, darker parts of the tunnel, systematically extinguishing each light source as it approached, consuming the fragile beacons of our sanity. Frank, with a burst of desperate strength, shoved us all back toward the relative safety of the main shaft, practically dragging Bradley, who had gone limp, a puppet of pure terror. But Tommy followed, relentless, his shovel still scraping, leaving a glistening trail of blood and something else, a clear, viscous fluid that reeked of hot copper and antiseptic, a sickening metallic tang. Kevin, stumbling in the glistening, treacherous fluid, went down hard. When Craig hauled him back up, we saw with sickening clarity that the fluid had eaten through his pants, leaving those same perfect circular burns on his legs, a horrifying brand. The elevator, thank the silent, unforgiving gods, was still there. But Duck was gone, utterly vanished, leaving only his rosary lying on the control panel, its beads partially melted, fused into the cold metal, a silent testament to his terror. Frank, drawing on years of experience, knew how to operate the elevator, his hands remarkably steady amidst our collective unraveling. As we began our frantic ascent, that rhythmic scraping sound, a relentless metallic heartbeat, followed us up the shaft, echoing from the abyssal depths below, growing closer, a horrifying impossibility given our rapid speed. The elevator, with a sudden gut-wrenching lurch, shuddered to a stop between levels, the cables groaning as if being torn, pulled from the unseen darkness below. Through the grated cage floor, a horrifying tableau. Tommy, a grotesque, broken figure, was climbing the sheer shaft walls, his mangled, skeletal fingers somehow finding purchase on the smooth metal. That shovel, still fused to one hand, carved deep, fresh grooves in the steel as he ascended, a horrifying signature. The emergency phone in the elevator was dead, a thick, suffocating static replacing any hope of communication, a sound almost like labored breathing. Craig, fueled by primal terror, began kicking at the emergency hatch, finally forcing it open. We clambered out onto the top of the elevator cage, then began the agonizing climb up the emergency ladder, bolted precariously to the shaft wall. My arms screamed with protest, muscles burning, but the alternative, whatever Tommy had become, reaching us, was a fate far more terrible. We burst out onto the surface just as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the world in hues of dying light, emerging from the auxiliary exit like newborn, terrified creatures. But the camp was empty, utterly, chillingly empty. Every building door stood agape, papers fluttering aimlessly in the cold wind, vehicles still idling, their doors ajar, abandoned. In the main office, we found the staff roster, and every single name, including ours, had been crossed out in that same sickening handwriting. Times of death were meticulously listed. 1433, a chilling revelation. 20 minutes before we had even descended to search. Craig seized the satellite phone, his fingers shaking, to call for evacuation, but the only response was a pre-recorded message from the corporate entity, stating that the Arctic Vein Minerals facility had been permanently closed due to a catastrophic equipment failure, dated 3 days prior. We commandeered the only functioning truck and drove for 14 uninterrupted hours to Anchorage, a silent, desperate flight. Not a single word was spoken, each of us consumed by the paralyzing fear that acknowledging what had transpired would somehow impossibly make it follow us. The moment we reached Anchorage, Frank, his face a mask of grim determination, drove directly to the state police station. But when we attempted to file a report, the officer, his brow furrowed, pulled up the Arctic Vein Minerals mine on his computer and presented us with a news article from a week earlier. According to the cold, impersonal text, the mine had been closed for renovation since August. No workers on site, completely shut down for safety upgrades. Our names, a chilling void, were not found in any employee database. Our contracts, our very existence at the mine simply did not exist. And when Craig, his voice strained, called his wife from the station phone, she calmly stated that he had been home all week, recovering from the flu. But we still had Kevin's legs, undeniably marked by those perfect circular burns. We still had my journal, its pages filled with meticulous dates and entries, undeniable proof. And we still had the cold, gritty dirt beneath our fingernails, a visceral reminder of our desperate climb up that shaft. The officer, his expression shifting from skepticism to a dawning, grave concern, took one look at Kevin's wounds, made a quick phone call, and within the hour, men in dark suits arrived. They were not FBI nor police, but something else entirely, something far more unsettling. No badges, just clipboards and gleaming medical equipment. They separated us systematically for questioning, holding us in different sterile rooms for 18 agonizing hours, barraging us with the same monotonous questions about gas leaks, hallucinations, and chemical exposure. Eventually, they presented us with papers to sign, non-disclosure agreements, medical waivers, documents admitting we had trespassed on private property and suffered from group psychosis brought on by carbon monoxide exposure. The alternative, they made terrifyingly clear without uttering a direct threat, was to vanish, to be erased, just like Tommy's crew. We accepted the settlement money, a sum calculated to ensure our silence and our comfort, and then we scattered like frightened birds. Craig fled to the sun-drenched anonymity of Florida. Frank retreated to the vast open spaces of Montana. Bradley, a shattered shadow of his former self, checked into psychiatric care. And Kevin, a silent, spectral presence, simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. A void. I found myself in Oregon, working construction, a desperate attempt to pretend those 3 harrowing weeks at Arctic Vein Minerals had never stained my existence. But sometimes in the dead of night, the rhythmic scraping sound, a phantom echo, still emanates from my walls, and I find my gaze instinctively drawn to my arms, searching, always searching for the circular burns that, as yet, have not appeared. I know the others hear it too because our group text, a silent pact, continues. No words are exchanged, just a simple check-in every Sunday at 14:33. So far, every single one of us still responds. Story 5. The Echoes of Silent Valley. The autumn of 1971 found me toiling for a small, nameless logging outfit, roughly 40 miles outside Hannes, deep within a wilderness where the spruce grew so impossibly thick, the oppressive shadows so profound, that visibility barely extended 10 feet. I was 32 then, a man hardened by 16 years of running chainsaws, and I believed with a naive certainty that I had witnessed every secret those woods harbored. My crew consisted of a mere 4 souls. Myself, old Walter, a man who had been felling timber since before my birth, a fresh-faced kid named Danny, barely out of high school, and Steve, our foreman, who largely managed the heavy equipment and the endless mundane paperwork. We had established our temporary camp at the very mouth of this valley, a place the locals referred to with an unsettling quiet as Silent Valley, though none of us paid much heed to the ominous moniker at first. The job on paper seemed straightforward: clear approximately 20 acres of ancient mature spruce to pave the way for a new access road the state desired. Good money, decent September weather, and we optimistically anticipated completing the work in 3 weeks. Tops. The initial days unfolded with the smooth, unnerving predictability of a well-oiled machine. Nothing truly out of the ordinary save for the peculiar, all-encompassing quiet that hung heavy in the air. Now I had worked in countless remote locales, but this valley possessed an almost peculiar quality to its silence, the kind that forces you to acutely notice the shallow, rhythmic cadence of your own breathing. Walter, a man whose skin was as leathery as an old boot, mentioned it on the 3rd day. He declared that in all his long, arduous years he had never before heard a forest so utterly devoid of bird calls, so chillingly bereft of the usual rustling and chittering of squirrels and other small, hidden creatures. But we had a job to do, and quiet woods, we reasoned, simply meant fewer distractions. So we pressed on, the silence a constant, unsettling companion. Our routine was the harsh, simple rhythm of the wilderness: roused at 5, a hasty breakfast over the sputtering camp stove, then plunged into the valley by 6 to begin the relentless cutting. We toiled until approximately 4 in the afternoon, then retreated to camp for dinner and a weary game of cards. The company had provided us with a 2-way radio for emergencies, but the towering, impassive mountains blocked most signals, leaving us isolated, truly alone in that vast, indifferent expanse. It was on the 5th night that I first heard them. The voices. I had turned in early, around 9, utterly spent from wrestling with a particularly stubborn ancient spruce that had consumed half my day to finally bring crashing down. The others, their laughter a distant, fragile sound, were still playing poker in Walter's tent, their muffled merriment drifting through the thin canvas walls. I was just beginning to surrender to the encroaching darkness of sleep when I heard what sounded undeniably like someone talking, far off in the suffocating depths of the valley. Not shouting, not calling out, but merely engaged in a regular low conversation, like 2 unseen individuals strolling and chatting. The truly unsettling part was the chilling clarity of the sound, despite the immense distance. Every few seconds I would catch a fleeting word or two, though never enough to grasp their meaning, a maddening, elusive whisper. I lay there for perhaps 20 agonizing minutes, straining my ears, desperately attempting to convince myself it was merely the wind playing its deceitful tricks, or perhaps sounds carrying from some distant phantom logging camp. But there were no other operations within 15 miles of our desolate outpost, and the wind, a silent, watchful entity, had been utterly still all day. The next morning at breakfast, I tentatively asked the others if they had heard anything strange during the long, dark night. Danny merely shrugged, shoveling more beans onto his plate with a youthful indifference, but Walter, his eyes ancient and knowing, gave me a long, piercing look over the rim of his steaming coffee cup. Steve admitted he thought he had heard something around midnight when he had stepped out to relieve himself. It sounded, he conceded, like people having a quiet conversation somewhere further up the valley. He had initially rationalized it as hunters who had wandered through, though hunting season was still a month away, and we had seen no tracks save our own. Walter finally broke his silence, his voice low and heavy, stating that he had been hearing things for the past 2 nights but hadn't wanted to spook anyone. Voices, he repeated, sometimes just one, sometimes several, always emanating from deeper within the valley where we had not yet cut. The strangest aspect, he elaborated, was how they seemed to echo off the mountains in ways that defied all logic, as if the sound were bouncing off invisible walls that simply were not there. We attempted to joke about it that morning, Danny nervously suggesting it might be Bigfoot's family reunion. But the laughter was forced, hollow, dying quickly in the pervasive quiet. When we ventured back into the valley for work, a new disquieting observation descended upon us all. Our chainsaws seemed unnaturally louder than usual, their roar amplified, as if the sound had no other noise to contend with. No birdsong, no insect's hum, not even the usual rustle of small animals fleeing our approach. Just the raw, deafening scream of our saws and the thunderous, shuddering crash of falling timber. Around noon, I was working a section about 100 yards from the others when my saw abruptly died. Just cut out completely with a sudden, unnerving silence. In that profound, heavy quiet, I heard them again. The voices. This time they were clearer, sharper, and I could have sworn they were speaking English, yet the words kept slipping away from my comprehension, like trying to grasp the fragments of a dream immediately upon waking. They seemed to emanate from 3 distinct directions at once, a spatial impossibility given the contorted shape of the valley. I yanked the pull cord, forcing my saw back to life with a desperate roar, and worked the remainder of the day with my jaw clenched tight, the unspoken terror a cold knot in my stomach. That night, none of us dared to admit the chilling truth that we were profoundly spooked, but we all lingered longer than usual around the flickering campfire, avoiding the solitary darkness of our tents. Steve had attempted to use the radio earlier, desperately hoping to reach the distant company office, but all we received was a harsh, crackling static, laced with these weird, almost rhythmic pulses, a phantom heartbeat in the silence. Walter, his voice a low, somber murmur, recounted how he had worked this very area back in '58 with a different crew, and they had abandoned a job about 10 miles north after only 2 weeks. He wouldn't elaborate on the precise reason why, only stating with a knowing grimace that the forest up here possessed a cunning ability to play tricks on you, to make you hear things that weren't there, or maybe were there but shouldn't be. He recalled one of the men from that old crew, a man named Joseph, who had spoken of the old-timers, the truly ancient ones who carefully avoided these valleys. They whispered that the mountains themselves held sounds from long ago, conversations from people who'd passed through decades or even centuries back. I longed to challenge his words, to dismiss them as ancient superstitions, but sitting there, the firelight barely piercing the oppressive dark, and those chilling voices still echoing in the cold chambers of my memory, I kept my mouth shut, swallowed by an encroaching dread. The 7th night shattered everything. I awoke around 2 in the morning to the sound of my own name being called. Not shouted, not whispered, but spoken with a chilling, plain clarity, as if someone stood directly outside my tent seeking my attention. "Tom," it said then again. "Tom." The voice was familiar yet subtly wrong, a distorted echo like hearing a recording of yourself played at the wrong speed, a horrifying mimicry. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap, prepared to unleash a torrent of angry words upon whoever was toying with me. But there was nobody there. The sharp beam of my flashlight sliced through the empty air, revealing nothing but the silent other tents and the dark, impassive line of trees beyond our camp. Then I heard it from the opposite direction. My name again. The same eerie voice, the same unnerving calm tone. I spun around, and that's when I saw Walter standing outside his tent, flashlight in hand, his face a mask of profound confusion, mirroring my own. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. And before I could even formulate a reply, we both heard Danny's voice, clear as crystal, emanating from the depths of the valley. Except Danny was in his tent. We could discern his huddled form through the thin canvas, sitting up in his sleeping bag. Steve stumbled out of his tent, his voice thick with alarm, demanding to know what the hell was going on. And that's when the fabric of reality truly began to unravel. We heard Steve's voice too, unmistakably, emanating from the tree line, asking the exact same question he had just uttered, but with a chilling, hollow quality, like an echo that paradoxically preceded the original sound. We stood there, 4 grown men, clad in our underwear and boots, frozen by a primal terror, listening to our own voices, engaging in conversations we were not having, emanating from places where we were not standing. The most horrifying moment came when we heard Walter's voice, distinct and clear from deep within the valley, speak words none of us had yet articulated. We should leave. Pack up right now and leave. The real Walter merely stood there, his mouth agape, because those were the exact unspoken words he had been about to utter. I could read the chilling confirmation in his wide, terrified eyes. We did pack up some of our gear that night, throwing it haphazardly into the truck, poised to bolt at the first faint glimmer of dawn. But Danny, fueled by a misguided bravery or perhaps just sheer idiocy, somehow convinced us to stay. He argued with a desperate, youthful logic that we would never live it down if we fled from some weird echo phenomenon, probably caused by temperature inversions or some scientific thing we didn't understand. The next morning, day 8, Walter was gone. His tent remained meticulously zipped from the inside, his sleeping bag neatly laid out as if he had merely stepped out for a minute. But his boots were missing, and so was he. We found his tracks, clear and purposeful, heading into the valley, not like someone stumbling blindly in the dark. We followed them for approximately a quarter mile before they simply ceased. They did not gradually fade, nor did they merge with other tracks. They just ended mid-stride in a patch of soft earth nestled between 2 massive, silent spruces. Steve attempted the radio again, managing to secure a crackling, ghost-like connection to report Walter missing. But the static was so pervasive, so utterly overwhelming, he couldn't be certain if anyone had heard him. We spent the entire morning searching, calling Walter's name until our throats were raw and bleeding. But the only answer we received was our own voices, distorted and mocking, bouncing back from directions that defied all geometric sense. Around noon, Danny discovered Walter's chainsaw, approximately 300 yards from where the tracks had so abruptly ended. It sat upright, propped against a tree as if someone had carefully, deliberately placed it there. The chain was pristine, utterly clean, the gas tank full. There was no sign it had been used that day. We were in the process of packing up to leave, the job, the money, all forgotten in the face of our terror, when we heard it. Walter's chainsaw unmistakably started up somewhere deeper within the valley. That distinctive ironbark growl, a sound Walter had meticulously modified himself by altering the muffler to produce a particular unique resonance, was utterly unmistakable. We stood there frozen, paralyzed by a cold dread because we could see Walter's saw, undeniably sitting right there in the back of Steve's truck, precisely where we had just placed it. But the sound persisted, steady and workmanlike, occasionally revving high as if biting, tearing through unseen wood. Steve, his face grim, snatched his rifle from the truck and we began to move toward the sound, though every primal instinct in my body screamed, pleaded for me to run in the opposite direction. The sound led us to a grove we had not yet touched, and when we finally reached it, we found freshly cut stumps, sawdust still settling, a fine, ghostly powder in the frigid air. The smell of pine pitch and the sharp, metallic tang of bar oil hung heavy, suffocating. The cuts were clean, professional, exactly as Walter with his meticulous skill would have made them. But there was no one there, and the sound of the chainsaw had ceased the very moment we entered the grove. It was then that Danny, his voice a strained whisper, noticed the chilling impossibility. The trees had been cut from the inside out. The stumps were situated in the absolute center of the grove, yet there were no drag marks, no path cleared to access that inner sanctum. It was as if someone or something had begun cutting from the very heart of an untouched stand of timber. That was enough for us. We ran back to camp, throwing everything into the trucks without even the pretense of folding the tents properly. We bundled everything up with a desperate, frantic haste, as if our very lives depended on escaping that place immediately. As we loaded the final pieces of gear, I heard it one last time. Walter's voice, clear and chillingly close, as if he stood directly behind me. "The valley keeps what it wants," he said. And when I spun around, there was nobody there, just Danny and Steve already in their trucks, engines roaring, ready to flee. I didn't tell them what I had heard. We sped out of there, doing 40 on a logging road meant for a mere 15 miles per hour, tools bouncing wildly in the truck beds, not caring if we wrecked the suspension. Approximately 5 miles down the treacherous road, we passed a Forest Service truck heading up toward the valley. The ranger, an older man with deep, knowing lines etched around his eyes, flagged us down, inquiring if we were the crew who had called in about a missing worker. Steve, his voice strained, did the talking, explaining about Walter, pointing out our camp's location on the map. The ranger simply nodded, a silent, grim understanding in his gaze, as if he had heard this same story countless times before. He stated they would dispatch a search team, but the way he uttered the words, I knew with a chilling certainty that he didn't expect them to find anything. They searched for 2 long, agonizing weeks, finally discovering Walter's body on day 12. He was found sitting at the base of a tree approximately 2 miles from our camp, in an area we had meticulously searched at least 3 times. The coroner's report stated he had been dead for at least 10 days, a chilling impossibility given his disappearance. No signs of injury, no animal predation, just sitting there, eyes closed, as if he had merely decided to take a nap and never awakened. His feet were bare and pristine, utterly clean, bearing no marks of having walked 2 miles through the unforgiving forest. The phantom chainsaw sounds, the disembodied voices, the trees cut from the inside out, none of that made it into the official report. The authorities attributed his death to carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater in his tent, claiming he had wandered off, disoriented, and succumbed to exposure. But his tent, I knew, did not possess a heater, and the cold had not been severe enough for exposure. Steve and Danny never spoke of it again, a shared, silent trauma, and I never returned to logging. I work construction now, a safe, mundane existence in town where the only sounds are the ones that make logical sense. But sometimes on those eerily quiet nights, I still hear Walter's voice, a chilling whisper from the past, repeating those words. And I know, with an absolute terrifying certainty, that Valley is still out there, still silently, patiently keeping whatever it desires to keep. Story 6. The Watching Wolves of Bill Carver's Basin. In the harsh grip of January 1978, I was a part of the search team dispatched to find old Bill Carver deep in the desolate expanse near the Yukon River Basin. By then, I had accrued about 6 years of wilderness rescue experience, mostly extracting lost hunters from the labyrinthine woods or aiding stranded motorists on remote, forgotten roads. But Bill, he was different. He belonged to that rare breed of old-timers, men who knew the unforgiving land with an intimacy that surpassed most of us knowing our own backyards. When his sister Martha called from Fairbanks, her voice edged with worry, reporting he hadn't checked in since early November. Everyone initially dismissed it, assuming his radio had simply given up the ghost. The man, though pushing 63, was as tough and resilient as boot leather, having trapped that same brutal stretch of wilderness since before my birth. We granted it another few weeks, fully expecting him to materialize at the trading post in Circle City as he always did around Christmas. When he didn't, that's when they called us in, a grim finality to their voices. The flight out there, a 3-hour ordeal in a tiny bush plane, was a constant battle against fierce crosswinds, buffeting us through the unforgiving sky. Bill's cabin sat approximately 40 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, tucked into a secluded bend where Birch Creek fed into a larger, unnamed tributary. From the air, the place immediately appeared wrong, a stark anomaly in the pristine white landscape. The roof, on one side, was grotesquely caved in under the immense weight of accumulated snow, and no tracks, not a single one, led to or from the cabin, as if it were a tomb sealed by the elements. There was no telltale wisp of smoke curling from the chimney, a silent sentinel. Roger, the pilot, a weathered man who had been navigating these routes since the 50s, kept circling lower and lower, both of us scanning, our eyes straining for any hint of movement, any sign of life. The strangest, most unsettling detail was the utter absence of the dogs. Bill always kept 3 or 4 sled dogs, but there was no sign of them. No paw prints in the untouched snow, no chain lines marking their presence, nothing. Roger set us down on the frozen creek about a quarter-mile away, and I vividly remember the profound, crushing silence that descended when he cut the engine. Not even the whisper of wind, just that heavy, pressing quiet unique to deep winter, when the temperature plunges to 40 below, and everything living has either fled or burrowed deep into the earth, waiting. We had to break trail through approximately 3 feet of powder snow to reach the cabin, an exhausting, soul-sapping endeavor even with snowshoes. The door stood partially open, frozen that way, a drift of snow piled up inside the entrance like a miniature icy glacier. I called out Bill's name several times, my voice hollow and fragile, but it seemed to be swallowed whole by all that white, oppressive emptiness, lost to the indifferent wilderness. Roger remained behind, a watchful shadow while I squeezed through the narrow doorway. And the first thing that struck me was the disquieting organization of everything. His supplies were stacked with meticulous precision along the walls, bags of flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, enough easily to sustain him through March. The wood stove was cold, had been for weeks judging by the fine layer of frost coating the iron. His bunk was made up with military corners, the wool blankets pulled smooth, taut. Even his tools were laid out on the workbench, gleaming as if he had just finished cleaning them, a silent, ritualistic display. The only object out of place was a chair, pulled up to the small table by the window, and on that table, lying open, was his journal. The journal was one of those thick, leather-bound books, the kind specifically marketed at trading posts for trappers to meticulously record their observations. Bill's handwriting was small and precise, the elegant cursive loops of a man who had learned penmanship in an era when it was still taught with proper discipline in schools. Most of the entries were what one would expect: trap yields, weather observations, notes about animal movements. But starting around mid-November, the tone shifted, growing strange, unsettling. He began writing about wolves, an unsettling abundance of them, far more than he had ever witnessed in his 40 years of working that territory. At first, his entries were mere observations. 7 wolves passed the cabin heading north at dawn, or fresh tracks by the woodpile, big male, probably 140 dlib. Then the entries grew longer, more detailed, infused with a creeping unease. He described how they would meticulously circle the cabin at night, not howling, not hunting, but merely walking, round and round in the undisturbed snow. He counted them by the eerie reflection of his lantern light in their eyes through the window. Sometimes 12, sometimes 15. Once he chillingly wrote 23, though he added a hesitant question mark, as if he himself could barely believe the impossible number. By late November, Bill's entries adopted an entirely different, darker tone. He wrote about how the wolves had ceased hunting, had stopped their natural migratory movements. They simply remained, a constant silent presence, always within sight of the cabin during the day, sitting motionless in the tree line as if waiting for something unseen, something terrible. He attempted to fire his rifle over their heads to frighten them off, but they didn't even flinch. Their emerald eyes unwavering, an unnerving display of indifference. One entry from November 28th burrowed deep into my memory, chilling me to the bone because of the sheer force with which he had pressed the pencil into the paper, almost tearing through it. They know I'm alone. Somehow they know. He began rationing his ammunition after that, a desperate, dwindling supply. He stopped venturing out to check his trap lines, a tacit admission of profound fear. The last few entries described how he would hear them on the roof at night, their claws scraping against the tin, a relentless, rhythmic scuttling directly above his bunk. He had reinforced the door with extra boards, moved all his food into metal containers, a futile attempt at security. On December 3rd, he wrote that his dogs had fallen silent in their shed out back. Not barking, not whining, just a profound, unsettling quiet. When he peered out the window the next morning, the shed door stood open and the dogs were gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. The final entry, dated December 7th, was a mere 3 lines long, a chilling epitaph. No more firewood inside. Have to go to the pile. They're sitting in a perfect circle around the cabin now, about 30 F'd out. We'll make the run at noon when the sun's highest. That was it. Nothing after that. I stood there in that freezing, silent cabin, reading those words over and over, desperately trying to construct some shred of sense from the unfolding horror. Roger had entered by then, and he was methodically sifting through Bill's supplies, checking dates on canned goods, examining everything with his usual meticulous way. Neither of us dared to voice the chilling truth that we both knew. A man like Bill Carver does not simply abandon a fully stocked cabin in the brutal, unforgiving heart of an Alaskan winter. We searched the immediate area until dark, our desperate calls swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. We found the woodpile he had mentioned, approximately 50 yards from the cabin, but no tracks, no blood, no sign of Bill. The snow around it was smooth and undisturbed, as if it had been falling steadily for weeks, without anything or anyone breaking through its pristine surface. That night we made camp in the cabin, though neither of us found much sleep. Roger kept the fire going, its flickering light a fragile barrier against the oppressive dark, while I more carefully sifted through Bill's personal effects, desperately seeking anything that might explain his impossible disappearance. In a wooden crate beneath his bunk, I found something that tightened my chest with a cold vice of dread. Letters he had been writing to his sister but never sent, dated throughout November. In them, he spoke of the profound isolation, the oppressive weight of the darkness lengthening each day, how he would find himself talking aloud just to hear the sound of a human voice. In one letter, he confessed to seeing things in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't be there, movement where there was none. He attributed it to the crushing lack of sleep, claiming the wolves kept him awake all night with their relentless pacing. But then, he had crossed out entire paragraphs, as if second-guessing his own sanity, no longer trusting his own perception. The last letter, dated December 2nd, was a single, chilling paragraph. Martha, if something happens to me, know it wasn't the cold or carelessness. This place does things to a man's mind. The wolves aren't acting like wolves anymore, or maybe I'm not acting like a man. Hard to tell the difference after a while. Around 3 in the morning, Roger gently shook me awake. He stood by the window, a silent, rigid sentinel, and when I joined him, I understood with a fresh wave of terror why he had woken me. There were wolves out there, perhaps 6 or 7 of them, sitting motionless in the snow, precisely at the edge of where our lamplight reached. They weren't doing anything, just sitting there, facing the cabin, their eyes reflecting an eerie, cold green in the profound darkness. We watched them for perhaps an hour, neither of us speaking, a shared, suffocating silence, and they never moved, never made a sound. Then, just before the first pale hint of dawn, they all stood up at the exact same moment with an unsettling, synchronized precision, and walked away in single file, melting seamlessly into the impenetrable trees. Roger turned to me and spoke the first words either of us had uttered in hours. "We're leaving now." We packed up Bill's journal and his personal effects for his sister, leaving everything else to the silent dominion of the valley. As the plane lifted off, banking sharply, I looked back and saw them. There had to be 20 or 30 wolves emerging from the deep shadows of the forest, moving with a deliberate, purposeful gait toward the abandoned cabin. They weren't running or hunting, just walking steadily, as if reclaiming something that had always inherently belonged to them. The official report we filed stated that Bill Carver had likely suffered from cabin fever, wandered off into the trackless wilderness, became disoriented, and succumbed to the elements. That's what gets written on paper when there is no body, no concrete evidence of foul play. His sister, though heartbroken, accepted it, stating she had worried about him being out there alone at his age. But Roger and we knew a different, chilling truth. Over the next few months, I embarked on my own quiet investigation, talking to other trappers who had worked that area over the years. It turned out Bill wasn't the first to disappear from that particular cursed stretch of land. An old Alaskan man in Circle City, his face a map of ancient sorrows, told me his grandfather used to trap there in the 1920s but had abandoned it after one brutal winter. He declared, his voice low and grave, that the wolves in that region weren't right, that they remembered things, held grudges maybe. He wouldn't elaborate further, merely shaking his head and abruptly changing the subject, his eyes distant. I unearthed records of 3 other trappers who had vanished without a trace in that same area between 1951 and 1969. All of them experienced seasoned outdoorsmen, all of them gone during the unforgiving winter months. I returned once the following summer with a small team, determined to conduct a more thorough search. The cabin had completely collapsed by then, a mere pile of rotting logs and rusted metal, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. We found bones scattered around the area, too old to be Bill's, and when we dispatched them to the university for analysis, they returned as a mix of caribou, moose, and dog remains. But there was one set, a profoundly disturbing anomaly that the lab could not identify. They stated they were similar to human but not quite right, as if the proportions were subtly, unsettlingly off. They desired to conduct more tests, but the samples inexplicably were lost in shipping back to Anchorage, if one could believe such a convenient disappearance. What truly remained with me, however, was what we discovered carved into a tree approximately 100 yards from where the cabin had once stood. It was ancient, the bark having partially grown over it, but one could still discern the chilling words. They learn, they wait, they remember. No date, no initials, just those 7 profound, terrifying words cut deep into the living wood. After that summer search, I never returned to that part of the Yukon Basin, and neither did Roger. He quit flying bush routes altogether about a year later, retreating to Ketchikan to ferry tourists around instead. We never spoke of what we witnessed that morning, a shared, unspeakable burden, but I know it irrevocably altered something in both of us. I still pursue search and rescue work, but now, whenever someone vanishes in that particular cursed region, I find myself inexplicably always booked up with other assignments. Call it cowardice if you wish, but there are places in Alaska that do not belong to us, never have. The old-timers knew it. The indigenous peoples, they knew it long before that. Bill Carver in his isolation forgot it. Or perhaps the crushing solitude eroded his belief. Every winter when I hear about wolves on the news, the mundane, expected reports of livestock attacks or sightings near towns, I think about those ones near Bill's cabin sitting so impossibly still in the snow, waiting with a patience that did not seem animal at all. The strangest thing happened about 5 years after Bill disappeared. His sister Martha called me out of the blue, her voice tinged with a bewildered awe. She had received a package with no return address postmarked from Dawson City. Inside was Bill's wallet, the leather worn smooth with age, his driver's license, and a faded photo of his sister still tucked inside, along with $17 in cash. Nothing else, no note, no explanation, just those perplexing, chilling items. The wallet showed no signs of weather damage. It looked as if it had been meticulously stored somewhere dry all those years. She asked me what I thought it meant, and I told her I didn't know, which was the honest, terrifying truth. But sometimes, late at night, when sleep refuses to claim me, I wonder if perhaps Bill is still out there somewhere, living by different, unspeakable rules now, running with things that once were wolves but learned how to be something else entirely. Or perhaps the wallet was merely some other trapper's idea of a kindness, returning what they had found in the vast, indifferent wilderness. I prefer not to dwell on it too deeply. Some questions I've learned are better left unasked, and some places are far better left utterly alone. That's the chilling lesson I absorbed that winter of 1978, and it's a lesson I have never and will never forget.